Bibliophiles of the internet, my name's Adriana, and today I'm here to bring you my April wrap-up. The first thing I read in April was my arc of Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. This is an upcoming queer new adult romance about Alex Claremont Diaz and Prince Henry, who are respectively the first son of the United States and the Prince of Wales. These two cannot stand each other, they are long-standing rivals, and that rivalry leads them to an incredibly embarrassing public incident at a royal wedding that gets snapped up by the press. As part of an elaborate cover-up to smooth over British-American relations, Alex and Henry have to pretend to be friends and spend lots of time together with a lot of public appearances. And that quality time makes them question whether what's between them is actually hate or something else. This book brought me a sense of what I can only call unchecked joy and hope, and I cannot wait for everyone else to finally read it. I really love this story for queering a beloved romance trope and taking it to new heights. I think audiences are continuously drawn to royal romances because there's a sense of sweeping fantasy when you think about these powerful, rich, often attractive characters who have access to these incredible experiences and places. And to think about those characters choosing love for themselves when their public persona is often so regimented and restricted in so many ways, there's something very attractive about that concept. Here we have that twofold because we have a first son and a royal prince, but this story makes those characters feel so genuine and human and grounded. In no small part because this story goes there and actually explores what it would really be like if two powerful pop culture icons like these turned out to be queer and in a romantic relationship. There would definitely be what we can call social consequences. So a big part of this story is Alex and Henry considering the ripples their relationship would make both positively and negatively and trying to gauge whether they want to take that risk and be true to themselves. Not only does this story center a wonderful queer relationship with such thoughtfulness, but it is laugh out loud hilarious. This book has some of the best top-notch banter and one-liners I've read in a very long time. It's one of those books that's so damn funny you will not be able to contain yourself in public spaces. It's also incredibly steamy and sexy, and I love it for that because getting to have queer characters who actually celebrate and revel in their own sexuality and sexual fulfillment is something we very much need in books. It's like most time in romances, I'm just like, yes, please, now kiss, and I just feel like on that front, this book totally had my back 100%. This is a delightful romantic comedy that perfectly balances steaminess, humor, vulnerability, authenticity, and unchecked hopefulness, while making me believe in something good and pure and true while I lived in its pages, and for that I gave it 4.5 stars. After that I listened to From Here to Eternity by Caitlin Doughty, read by the author herself. This is another nonfiction collection of essays in which death industry professional Caitlin Doughty travels across the world to research the death practices and rituals of many different cultural groups. This fascination of hers stems from how commercial, how removed, how clinical death practices have become specifically in the United States. I have so much respect for Caitlin Doughty's work because her perspective and her insatiable curiosity about death rituals and death practices and what those practices have to say about the living comes from such a passionate place. And in that way, she's able to make the audience feel safe in their discomfort. She really challenges the way Western cultures primarily fear death so much that this extreme fear has become intrinsically projected onto how we view and treat dead bodies themselves. In modern Western culture, there's this idea that dead bodies are disgusting, disturbing, gross, dirty, disease-ridden, full of germs, but those misconceptions only serve to further distance us emotionally and physically from the reality of death itself. Caitlin Doughty's mission is to really demystify death and dead bodies by showing us different cultures in this modern age who believe differently and who practice very different death rituals to show that there's more than one valid way to engage with death. And while American citizens especially are still very much at the mercy of a funeral industry that has become a big business that prioritizes monetary gain first, I like that this collection of essays showcases a softer, more human side of death practices. As always, Caitlin Doughty does great work, and I gave this second book of hers 5 stars. Then for Kathy's birthday, I finally reread In Other Lands by Sarah Reese Brennan. This is the queer satirical fantasy romp of my dreams, and I actually made a 5 reasons to read video where I do a deep dive into all of my feelings. So if you want to know more about the book and why it simultaneously fulfills and breaks me every time I so much as think about it, you should definitely check that out. Before I get into what I read for Tome Topple, I should talk about my poetry collection for April, which was American Sonnets for My Past and Future Assassin by Terrence Hayes. This is an amazing collection of 70 sonnets that Terrence Hayes wrote during the first 200 days of the Trump presidency that center Blackness, the systemic war against Blackness, and the lasting power of this country's horrific past. This collection shook me to my core because somehow Terrence Hayes has taken this classic form of poetry that can often seem antiquated, irrelevant, and let's be real, white, especially in a modern context, and has given that form new life. Sonnets are so structurally particular and complex. There's a certain number of lines, a specific rhyme scheme, a set number of syllables that need to be used in a certain order, and yet Terrence Hayes has crafted these sonnets in such a way that the speaker's voice is more free than restricted, and I don't know how he does it. He somehow makes sonnets feel like the most hip-hop, punk rock, badass form of poetry in existence, and it shouldn't work that way, and yet it does. The tone of this collection is so silky, so lyrical, with so much intent. The way Terrence Hayes plays with sound and word shapes to make his point is such an impressive feat. And he's able to compose these incredible lines that are so real and that so authentically express very real social concerns of today that it's like a knife twisting in your heart. I found something to love in every single piece, and that's exactly why I gave this collection 4.5 stars. Then for Tome Topple, the first book I read was The Kingdom of Copper by S.A. Chakraborty, the sequel to The City of Brass. This is epic historical fantasy inspired by Islamic mythology about Nadi, a seemingly ordinary con woman from 18th century Cairo who finds out that she belongs in the fabled mythical City of Brass. After accidentally summoning a powerful Jinn warrior, she has awakened these magical healing powers which make her a powerful chess piece to wield in this war-torn kingdom that cannot seem to sustain peace. This sequel is really intense, and I think it sustains that level of tension because there's so many levels of power at play in this book. One of the big ideas explored in this book is that power is relative. We have some big players in this story who are setting up a long game with way more strings to pull at their disposal, and we have small players who are more invested in immediate action and gratification. Those are two very different ways of navigating power, two different strategies that are often in conflict with each other, and that makes for a compelling dynamic. The story also switches between 3 main POVs from our 3 main characters, which means we have 3 different thought processes and 3 completely separate rationales for how Daevabad's regime must change. 3 different versions of justice, 3 different ideas for how to tip the scales. And because none of these ideas align or come into conversation with each other, that also builds suspense. Something else that captivates me is this fascinating juxtaposition of Nadi, a natural-born healer who's at a loss for how to heal Daevabad's fractured history and subsequent unrest. She's so used to commanding magic, just lifting her hands and willing things to put themselves back together. But in regards to sealing the deep-ridden wounds and pain of these tribes, she's almost out of her depth. And just like the first book, we also see how violence and destruction are instincts that are taught, and once they're taught, they're incredibly difficult to control or suppress. The story questions how can you live with perpetuating the same suffering you experienced yourself? How do you break out of that cycle? Is Daevabad just too broken to fix in the first place? And of course, Nadi is an amazing character who will not back down and who will not compromise her beliefs even when she's faced with impossible choices. She chooses her battles and keeps her ideas to herself, but she will not take anyone's shit. Most memorably in this book, there's a moment when she says, "I've had enough of men hurting me because they're upset." And I swear, in the time it took me to read those 9 words, my life changed. This is a very, very good sequel to a very, very good book, and I cannot wait for the trilogy conclusion. I gave this sequel 4.5 stars. And also for Tome Topple, I read A Crystal of Time by Somen Chainani, the 5th book in the School for Good and Evil series. This is a middle grade series that's basically about a school for good and evil where heroes, villains, and sidekicks study to embark on their own fairy tales. And in this second part of the hexology, there's a heinous imposter king who's threatening to rewrite and unmake those fairy tales in ways that may forever shift the balance. This one's tricky because I can't say too much since it's the 5th book in a 6-book series, but I should say that I did enjoy this installment slightly more than the 4th book. I feel like book 4 was a lot of exposition, a lot of catching up with this huge cast of characters and seeing where they were on their quest before they were brought together again, but since that was all established in the previous book, this book had a lot more space to breathe and focus. It was action-packed and exciting from start to finish, and I feel like the characters got to be who they truly are and let that come through in their choices. But there's also tension there because in this era of truth and lies, the characters never really know who to trust. There are characters plagued with self-interest, there's villains turned hero, heroes turned villains, and characters trying to do the right thing but not being able to figure out what that is. This installment also plays a little bit with time and dimension, and I thought it had an interesting take on that because it distinguishes between the true past and the perceived past. The perceived past is basically a personal revision of history where you've warped the past to fit what you wish you had done versus what you actually did, and I think that idea really has merit. One thing I do have to mention is that in the smallest, most unexpected moments, this story can be ever so slightly gender essentialist. For example, in this book there are trolls, I believe, and they're a more gender fluid species who can change their gender at will and then commit to a gender when they're older, which seems like a cool concept. And this one troll the characters encounter is like, yeah, I think I'm gonna be a boy when I grow up because all my other friends want to be girls, wink wink, and it's like, that's not how that works. That's not how any of this works. And then later in the story, the narration also refers to this same troll with her/him pronouns, which is also not great. It is the smallest detail that comes up for the briefest, weirdest moment in a 600+ page manuscript. But while there's so much of this story that I love, I do not like that. Otherwise, I enjoyed this story and I gave this installment 4 stars. And lastly, I was able to read Storm of Locusts by Rebecca Roanhorse. This is an Own Voices native post-apocalyptic urban fantasy story about a Dene monster hunter named Maggie whose ancient clan powers allow her to swiftly dispatch her enemies and become impossibly fast. In this sequel, a fanatical religious cult leader named the White Locust has risen to power, and he is threatening to further endanger this apocalyptic landscape unless Maggie and her gang of insurgents can upset his plans. First of all, I did make a 5 reasons to read video for the first book, and I have to say that this installment only made me feel even more of that excitement. This is a ruthlessly paced book. From cover to cover, it is non-stop action, non-stop badassery, constant suspense. I flew through this just from the sheer volume of quality content to process. My favorite part of this sequel is that it's basically about a kick-ass girl gang of native girls whose purpose is to stop the second coming of the apocalypse. I don't want to spell it out for you, but that's pretty badass. And because this comes from an Own Voices native perspective, it continues to do really fascinating things with world building, especially with the invocation of clan powers and their origins. There's something to be said about how confronting trauma is a source of power, how ancestry and mythology and tradition are sources of power themselves. Especially because the characters who wield those powers always go through something traumatic, and that trauma fundamentally alters their body and their personhood in such a way that unlocks these powers. That's a really interesting concept. And it just cuts past all the metaphorical bullshit that you see in like literally every other hero origin story in existence. Maggie also talks a bit about how time, fate, and nature itself find ways to make reparations for what has been lost. This again is connected to clan powers because Maggie's theory is that clan powers manifest themselves as a means to fix what was damaged or lost. So because she wasn't able to defend the people she loves, that's why she's been remade into someone who is incredibly fast and who can dispatch any number of assailants. That idea of regaining balance runs throughout the book. You see it in the way the Navajo Nation was better equipped to survive the apocalypse because they were already accustomed to scarcity and neglect by way of the government. So this idea of finding strength or advantage and siphoning power from the things that are meant to hurt you and try to minimize you is such a powerful concept. I just really, really love this series, and I know book 3 is going to make my entire world implode on itself, but I gave this one 4.5 stars. So those are all the books I read in the month of April. As always, if you've read any of these yourself, I would love to know what you think in the comments. But that's everything I had for this wrap up today. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope that you enjoyed it, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page. Bye!